accounting public could understand, what's a performance audit and why do we need them?
There's a couple different kinds of performance audits, but the performance audit that all the candidates are talking about, the kind of performance audit that Mary Taylor is currently doing, is an examination of the practices of an agency. It looks for a number of things. The first thing it looks for is inefficiencies and or duplication. Do you have two agency or two parts of the agency or two employees doing the same thing? If you are, that's a place that you can save money. The way that you do a performance audit is you look to compare it to, the hallmark is to compare it to external measurements. So it's data driven. Let me give you a couple quick examples. A performance audit might look at component costs within your agency. In government, obviously, your largest component cost is typically labor cost. The way a performance audit works now is, we'll take it for example, the Cuyahoga County Auditor's Office, Cuyahoga County Recorder's Office, which is actually done. You go out, you find what are called peer agencies. Who does that kind of work in that kind of environment? So Mary Taylor picked Summit County, which is Akron, Franklin County, which is Columbus, and Hamilton County, which is Cincinnati, and said, what do the wage costs look like? And what she concluded is that the Cuyahoga County office was paying more for their labor than their peer agencies. So you've got an external benchmark. Now, I proposed yesterday a revision to that process that would include private sector data sets. The question is, what if all those peer agencies, by virtue of the fact that they're public agencies, have a common problem with them? And what if they're paying more than the private sector? We have private sector analogs in the recorder's office. You clerk, you file, you copy, you scan, same kind of things that you do in a doctor's office. So we would, and my proposal, we not only look at the peer agencies from a public standpoint, but we go out and look at the private sector too, so that we give the decision makers, whether it's the recorder in the county, or maybe a state agency, or the legislature, the governor, some hard data to make good decisions about their labor cost structure. That's an example, but you can do that with everything. The cost of delivering services, your purchasing, the physical facilities that you're in, so that's what we're talking about.
How is that different? Or are you guys talking the same language when your opponent talks about performance audits, you talk about performance audit? Are you talking about the same thing, or is what he's proposing different than what you're proposing?
Well, I think we're talking about the same thing. You'd have to ask him precisely what he was talking about. But I think we're talking about increasing the use of that process that's already in place. Now, my papers that I've put out during the course of the campaign, I think my plan and my ideas are a great deal more detailed than my opponents, but I'll leave that. For example, he talks about expanding performance audits, and if you read his plan, what he says is, we're going to do more of them, we're going to train the people, and we're going to make sure there's enough money to do the job. Well, with respect, that's not really a plan. That's kind of common sense that you would have to do if you're going to undertake anything. If you're going to fix a car, you got to have the right people, you got to train them, you got to have enough money to do the job. I've proposed some changes to the way the process works. I just talked about one. A bigger change is I'd like to see Senate Bill 4 enacted with some additional ideas. For example, the governor ought to have to respond to a performance audit. We all know about, we've all written about and talked about government reports that sit on a shelf, right? They're kind of blue ribbon, we're going to figure out how to fix this. Social Security comes out and it just sits there collecting dust. I'd like to see a statute that says, Governor, when the auditor, whoever it is, sends you a performance audit about one of your agencies, you have to respond in writing and say, here are the recommendations that I'm adopting, here are the ones that I'm modifying and why I'm changing what you said, but I'm kind of going to do what you said, and then here are the ones I'm rejecting, and here's the reason why. And then I want to see the legislature turn around and modify whatever statutes need to be modified to accomplish the goals of the performance audit. That's going to raise the political costs of doing nothing, which seems to be what governments do best.
Interesting. It's good commentary.
As auditor, you'll be on the enforcement board, and John Husted, who's running for Secretary of State, says that even though his plan didn't get approved, that he'll push for a less partisan approach to redistricting if he's elected, and he'd be on that board. What's your feeling about that, what he's saying?
Well, I would say that by starting that I'm conservative and I feel that conservative ideas will win in a fair fight. I don't think we should be using the drawing of lines as a way to avoid persuading the voters that our ideas and our ideals are the best for the state. Now, that being said, the way I would conduct myself in office is to adhere to what I call the 3 C's. Compactness of district. I don't want to see any, spaghetti stretching from one end of the state to the other. Communities of interest, meaning that folks that are part of the same community shouldn't be represented by 2 different people just because they're on opposite sides of the street. And finally, competitiveness. Now, the first 2 criteria are constitutionally mandated. The third one is not. So to the extent that communities of interest and compactness come up against in tension with the competitiveness has to yield because it's not a constitutional requirement. But that's the way I'll approach the job.
And by competitiveness, you mean competitive balance, or what do you mean by competitiveness?
Competitiveness means that either party has a shot at winning the election.
What role do you think the auditor can play in, you hear a lot of talk about consolidation of county government, local township. Does the auditor's office have a role in that? What would it be?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that the primary function of the auditor's office is as an independent financial auditor. And while the auditor can make recommendations and be a source for information, it ought not to participate in the management of the state government that it audits. That would compromise the professional integrity of the process. Now, that being said, I think there's some things that can be done. We talk about in performance audits about duplication of services. One of the ways that the services are duplicated is you might have 5 small school districts that all employ a $85,000 a year treasurer. It ought to be possible to share those treasury services across district lines and by consolidating and sharing those services to save money. In terms of the collapsing of jurisdictions, which at a philosophical level I think is an absolute necessity if Ohio's going to be competitive nationally, I've heard over and over again from people who create jobs from entrepreneurs that the compliance costs of Ohio's myriad of local governments is a substantial burden against doing business here in Ohio. But at the end of the day, that's a question for the policy officers of the government, the governor and the legislature. So to sum up, I would see the auditors being a resource to identify possibility for shared services and the inefficiencies of multiple jurisdictions. At the end of the day, it's going to take the political branches leadership to be able to get there from here.
So how will you help convince the political leadership to enact your recommendations?
Well, I talked about the requirement to have at the state level for the governor to have to respond by statute. But beyond that, it's really going to require that ephemeral quality that we call leadership, the ability to go in and connect with people at their, on their turf and explain to them what the benefits are, to persuade them that this is the way things ought to go. One of the things that I've talked about, and this is just conceptual, and I don't think it's, I'm going to step outside my role as a candidate for auditor here and just talk as a concerned citizen, because I appreciate that question. We have a local government fund in Ohio. There's a lot of talk about cutting it out. There was a poll where a majority said that that's where you ought to cut, is the local, state and local government fund. It's made up of 6 major revenue streams. It's kind of revenue sharing with local governments. One thing we could do is set some benchmarks toward consolidation. How many legislative bodies do you have in the county? How many taxing authorities do you have in the county? How many elected officers do you have in the county? And instead of doing a top-down repair or consolidation or whatever you want to call it, give them the incentives to work it out on the local level. If you reach the 18-month goals, the benchmarks for consolidation, you get to keep 90% of your local government fund, but you're going to lose 30% of it instead of 10% of it if you don't make those benchmarks. Another benchmark, another year and a half, another benchmark maybe at 5 years. And by giving them the incentive to get together and work it out amongst themselves, we'll come up with dozens of solutions that are best suited to have to work for those local communities. What's going to work in Stowe is not going to work necessarily in Mercer County. And I think we need to recognize that the realities on the ground are different in every county, every community.
You talked about benchmarks. How would you go about developing those benchmarks that you just mentioned in terms of give them a reason to consolidate?
And those are things that would be for the policy branch to decide. I was talking about elected officials, taxing authorities, legislative bodies. There are other things that could be, the ratio of certain kinds of government apparatus to population. Those are statistical measures that could be negotiated and worked out by people of good faith.
Does it sound kind of cumbersome, though, with that many groups involved with trying to develop benchmarks?
I suppose it could be cumbersome. We're talking about fundamentally changing the structure of a government that's grown to be where it is over many, many decades. There isn't going to be any easy way to do this, but I do think that probably incentivizing local communities to come to a local agreement to attain those objectives is probably going to work better than somebody issuing an order in Columbus, Ohio.